Alright guys, welcome back for Section 5 of Intro to Criminal Justice. Today we are beginning our law enforcement section. Yay! Alright, so here's our funny picture of the section. Get it for stealing my nose? Alright, so law enforcement has kind of a very weird history, okay? Now, being that we come from, our legal system is based on the English common law system, which goes back to, prehistory. We're going to talk mostly here about the English history of law enforcement. So way back in the day, prior to the 19th century, there were a few different people and groups of people who did kind of the job of what we think of as the law enforcement job in the 21st century. But these were few and far between. They were not nearly as organized, as large, or as ubiquitous as law enforcement is today. So one of the groups responsible for kind of a law enforcement function were the parish constables, right? So every parish would have some kind of constable whose job it was to do basically a law enforcement function, kind of keep the peace, make sure, it didn't break out into all-out war, neighbor against neighbor, that kind of thing. But they didn't have nearly the legal authority that modern police do in some ways. In other ways, they had more. But the messed up part of this was that they were a volunteer organization. Right? So if you were the parish constable, you volunteered to kind of, keep the peace in your little area of the country. Then there were the shire reeves, right? So shire is a geographic area, and then the reeve was a position. And these shire reeves, this is where we get our term sheriff, right? You shove shire reeve together, you get shire reeve, sheriff, right? But the shire reeves, they had another kind of similar to law enforcement function, but that really evolved over a long time. When they first started, they had nothing really to do with any kind of law enforcement function, but as time went on, they got kind of more duties and more duties and more duties. In the big cities, there were city watchmen. These people would work only at night. They would kind of wander around and just make sure that there was no, kind of burglary going on, but also things like watching out for fire, watching out for, invaders from the city walls, that kind of thing. So they had both a law enforcement function and kind of a wider city watch function. The thief takers, these were kind of a lot more similar to the modern day bounty hunters, right? So if something was stolen from me, I could find one of these thief takers and say, hey, I will pay you to go find this thing that somebody stole from me. And if they could find the thing and bring the thief back to me, they would kind of earn their fee or whatever. And real, what we think of as modern day law enforcement didn't start in England or the United States, really, until the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829. So prior to 1829, there wasn't really what a modern observer would recognize as a law enforcement person or people or organization in either Britain or the United States. In the United States, so that all kind of, the top half of this slide is all about kind of Britain and where we came from. In the United States, as a separate thing, we started our own system with things like vigilante. We have had a long, sordid history with vigilantes in the United States. Some of these, when we think of vigilantes in the 21st century, who do we think of? Obviously Batman, right? I mean, Batman is like the quintessential vigilante for the late 20th, early 21st century. But in American history, these vigilantes were a lot less, let's say, a lot less moral or a lot less morally clear as Batman is. Because Batman, he's the greatest hero of all time. In American history, though, these vigilantes did a lot of really messed up stuff, right? So there would be, some crime would be committed in the town. the townspeople would just kind of assume it was so-and-so, and then they would get up a patrol to go out and essentially either, if you were really lucky, they would capture you and bring you to whatever law enforcement group's jail. The majority of the morally questionable part comes in when, instead of taking you to the jail or the police department or the sheriff's office or whatever, they would just tie you to a tree and hang you. There was a famous vigilante in the United States whose last name was Lynch, right? That's where we get the term lynch mob and lynching, which is essentially a form of vigilante justice in which they find a person that the mob believes committed a crime, usually an African American, and then they would hang them without any sort of trial or any sort of due process, and that became known as lynching. And that is obviously very morally, kind of the opposite of Batman, right? There were also slave patrols, right? So there were these entire kind of volunteer groups that would go out and look for runaway or escaped slaves prior to 1865 with the end of the Civil War. These patrols would just go out and look for escaped slaves. And if African Americans were out and about kind of without obvious job to do, without obvious, if it wasn't obvious that they were a slave doing something for their master, these slave patrols would, recapture them and either try to find their master or sell them off into slavery again. And it didn't matter really to these slave patrols whether these African Americans were actually free or whether they were, actually, on a job for a master. These slave patrols treated them not the best, is kind of the kindest, most PG way I can put that. But anyway, so American policing didn't start until this guy, August Vollmer, came along. And he was, similar to the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829 that created kind of modern day policing in Britain, August Vollmer kind of created modern day policing in the United States. And that was, God, what was that, late 1800s, early 1900s, somewhere in there. Long before you or I were ever born. But he kind of came along in California and created the first real police department in the United States that we would recognize as a police department, right? So, law enforcement, similar to what we talked about in previous sections, have three levels, right? There's the local, the state, and the federal. And each one of those kind of outranks the one or the ones below it, right? So a federal law enforcement officer has more power, has more ability to do certain things than state or local. Although, interestingly, there are a few situations where the state or local people or had more power than the people above them, which we'll talk about in a future section. Now, when we talk about these three different levels, each one has within it a jurisdiction. Okay. Now, the vast majority of the time when you're out and about talking just in a normal context, you're outside of a classroom, and you hear that word jurisdiction, whether it's a TV show or whatever, you think geographic jurisdiction. And geographic jurisdiction is one of the most important kinds of jurisdiction, right? So if I'm a Dallas police officer, right? I work for the Dallas Police Department. My jurisdiction ends essentially at the city limits, right? If I am, a Billy Bob County Sheriff's Officer, my jurisdiction ends at the edge of Billy Bob County. If I am a New Hampshire State Patrol Officer, I can go anywhere in the state, and that is my geographic jurisdiction, right? But there are other kinds of jurisdiction. It's not just geographic. There's also jurisdiction based on, say, what crime was committed, right? So, for instance, murder. The vast majority of the time, Murder is a state-level crime. So if the state police department wants to investigate that crime, they have the jurisdiction to do that because it's a state-level crime. The federal government can't come in and say, no, we want to take over the investigation of this crime unless they have some kind of federal reason why they need to. So for instance, if the person that was murdered was a federal judge, right, then the federal government can step in and investigate that murder. But if the victim murdered was just, Billy Bob, John Q. Citizen person, the state government is going to have jurisdiction there because they are the laws against murder are state laws, right? So there's also jurisdiction. So there's jurisdiction based on geography. There's jurisdiction based on what law was broken. There's jurisdiction based on who the victim is. There's even jurisdiction based on who the offender is, right? So if the offender, say, is a juvenile, they might have a different law enforcement group that has kind of the jurisdiction to investigate and investigate that crime, right? One of the things we have to talk about when talking about jurisdiction is the Posse Comitatus Act. Now, this has changed drastically over the years, okay? But essentially, the Posse Comitatus Act says that within the United States, you are not allowed, or the government, I should say, is not allowed to use the military in a law enforcement capacity. And this has been law since, the 19th century. This is a very, very old law. The United States is not allowed to use the military in any kind of law enforcement capacity, unless, in the very long time that this Posse Comitatus Act thing has been around, they have carved out lots and lots and lots of exceptions to this, okay? So first off, the National Guard is far less constrained by this than, say, the normal U.S. military, the normal, the Navy, the Marines, etc. So the National Guard kind of has a different set of criteria. It also doesn't apply if they're only providing like intelligence and support, right? So the U.S. Navy can call the U.S. Border Patrol and say, hey, we just saw a drug boat coming in, in this area of the Gulf of Mexico, right? So that's just providing intelligence, right? They're allowed to do that. They're allowed to provide training, right? So the U.S. Army is allowed to come in and train police departments. The Coast Guard is completely exempt. The Coast Guard is allowed to do all kinds of law enforcement stuff, even though the Coast Guard is in this really weird position where they're kind of sort of the military, but they're also kind of sort of civilian law enforcement, and they're a really weird bridge between the two groups. So the Posse Comitatus Act has lots and lots of exceptions. If it's a border issue, the military is allowed to have kind of more of a law enforcement presence than otherwise. It's still not complete. They're allowed to do whatever they want, but so there are lots of exceptions to this. But the basic rule is the U.S. military cannot perform any kind of law enforcement function. So obviously, if you've studied U.S. history for more than 5 minutes, you know that we have a very long history of kind of racism and sexism and keeping racial and ethnic minorities and women out of certain areas, certain careers, certain, social niceties, if you will. And one of those areas was definitely law enforcement, right? So up until very recently, like well within living memory, law enforcement officers were basically exclusively white men, right? End of list. If you were not male, you could not be a police officer. If you were not Caucasian, you were not a police officer. But that has definitely changed, especially since, say, the 70s and 80s. There are far more female law enforcement officers, or far more African American, Hispanic law enforcement officers. And the reasoning there, the kind of, prior to this being the case, the reasoning was women don't have the strength to be a police officer, right? And then they kind of followed police officers around, and they noticed that 99.999% of the time, you know, the vast majority of officers throughout their entire careers really never had to use their upper body strength to, say, you know, drag their partner out of a gunfight, right? Like, that was the excuse used to keep women out. Like, if their partner gets shot, how are they going to drag them out of this gunfight? And they realized that basically never happens. Like the vast majority of police officers will never get in a gunfight, let alone have to drag their partner out of a gunfight. So, like, why are you excluding half of the country from law enforcement careers based on they can't do this thing that really never happens, right? So then they started allowing females to be law enforcement officers, and they've been great, fine law enforcement officers. But so the reasoning now why we specifically want African American and female and Hispanic and all these different kinds of law enforcement officers is because groups, communities, neighborhoods really should be policed by the people like them, right? So basically any community in this country is going to be roughly half male, half female, right? Shouldn't the people policing them be roughly half male, half female, right? If a neighborhood is roughly half Caucasian, half African American, shouldn't the people policing them be roughly half Caucasian, half African American? I mean, police should be the normal people of the area that they're policing, right? So we want to make sure that we have African American officers. We want to make sure that we have Hispanic police officers. We want to make sure that we have Asian police officers, Christian police officers, and Jewish police officers, and Muslim police officers, depending on kind of where they are, what kind of community they're going to be policing. Because there's a lot of times when those different cultures can have very different approaches that will work to calm situations, to reduce tensions, to prevent violence. We need people of different cultures and different areas and different beliefs to be able to kind of navigate those situations in a way that will minimize kind of negative social impact, right? Law enforcement is constrained by certain rules, right? And we'll talk lots about what a lot of those rules are in a future section. But law enforcement, they're allowed to do different things to the citizens they come across based on these two standards, which are listed here at the bottom of the slide. So they're right there, right? You see them? Whoop, whoop. Okay, those two. So in order to arrest somebody, right, that is kind of the ultimate in denying someone their rights, right? You're denying them the right to move freely. You're denying the right to sleep in their own bed at night, right? You're taking them out of society in handcuffs, almost exclusively. In order to arrest somebody, a police officer needs probable cause. Does this mean they have to be convinced that this person committed some crime? No. It just means they have to have probable cause. Now, exactly how that probable cause is defined gets really technical and really legally nitpicky. But in general, probable cause basically means essentially would a reasonable person believe that this suspect committed some crime, and do we have enough knowledge of the situation and enough evidence to think, yeah, he probably did something wrong? A lawyer is going to tell you a far different definition. I am not a lawyer, but that's essentially what it means. And that is a much lower standard than that whole beyond a reasonable doubt thing that a jury needs to convict somebody, right? So probable cause is an important standard, and law enforcement has to be able, before they arrest somebody, they have to be able to say, look, here is my probable cause for arresting this person. This is the evidence I have. This is what I witnessed. This is what the other witnesses that saw the crime said. This is the evidence I found on the bad guy. This is, all the evidence, both witness evidence, material evidence, documentary evidence, all these things. This is why I think this person deserves to be arrested. So they have to be able to show and describe that probable cause. Even lower than that is what's called a reasonable suspicion, right? Is there some reason, any reason to believe that that person might be doing some kind of bad thing? This is the standard for things like stopping and investigating, right? So if, a police officer is just driving around in his patrol car and he sees John Q. Citizen walking down the street, that is not reasonable suspicion. But let's say he just heard on the radio that, somebody in a blue hoodie had robbed a store 2 blocks from where he is right now, and he looks out and sees a guy in a blue hoodie walking down the street. Now that reaches the level of reasonable suspicion. He's allowed to stop, talk to the guy, be like, hey, you happen to rob a store down the street? But it's, again, a lot of this legal speech is based on reasonableness. What is reasonable? And that's very difficult to define, very, very hard to enforce. But, that's up to the judge, essentially, right? A lot of questions come down to, well, which judge do you have? All right, so federal law enforcement. What different kinds of federal law enforcement do we have? There's different groups that have completely different jobs at the federal level, but there's a whole bunch of different kinds of federal law enforcement. If anybody out there watching this is in the military, you are very familiar with that first one, the military police, right? Military police are soldiers or sailors or airmen or Marines that are, subject to all of the rules and regulations and basic training and all that stuff that any other military person would be. But their specific job within the military is to police the military. And this is a completely separate group than any other kind of federal law enforcement. They're really different, really weird, because they do not enforce normal federal law. They can, but they also enforce, and kind of some may argue with me, but their main job is to enforce what's called the UCMJ, or the Uniform Code of Military Justice. This is a special set of federal laws that only apply to people who are in the military. They have their own courts, they have their own laws, they have their own things that they're not allowed to do that would be perfectly legal for you or I who are not in the military to do. So for instance, a good example of this is that in the military, if you are subject to the UCMJ, it is illegal for you to have an affair either as a military person or with a military person, right? I actually had a friend who had to get investigated by the military police because they believed he was having an affair with a married female soldier, and he totally cleared. They were just friends, but there was an investigation because there was a suspicion that they were having an intimate relationship. So there is the military personnel live under this kind of completely different set of rules. There's also the tribal police, right? So Native American groups in the United States, if they live on a reservation, those reservations are in this very weird legal area where they're kind of subject to federal law and they're kind of independent nations, right, with their own federal or equivalent of federal law, right? It's this very strange kind of legal in-between area where they're kind of sort of part of the United States and they're kind of sort of sovereign and on their own and separate from the United States. And it kind of depends on exactly what kind of law you're talking about. But the federal government does kind of hire, train, and staff tribal police. So on these reservation areas with these Native American groups are living on, the police function there. They don't have state police, they don't have local police, they only have these federal tribal police that perform the policing function in those geographic areas. And then, of course, there's the civilian federal police, which there's over 50 of these. There's a ton of these different groups. And essentially, every government agency, from the Department of Justice to the Department of the Interior to the Department of Agriculture to the Environmental Protection Agency, has their own law enforcement agency that is separate from all other federal law enforcement that works just for that group. Okay, so I have here listed just some of these. These are some of the bigger, more famous, more important ones, right? So the Marshal Service, the U.S. Marshal Service. I'm sure you've all seen, the old Western movies with the marshals, and they have a little badge, and, it's like, I'm the law in this town, or whatever. In the 21st century, the marshals are essentially the law enforcement group for the court system. Right? So whenever the court system needs its own law enforcement group, they have the marshals. So essentially the marshals' job, most of their job is transporting prisoners, like federal prisoners. If you're a federal prisoner in a prison in Indiana, but you're going to court at a courthouse in Miami, it's the Marshal Service that will transport you from that prison to the courthouse and back. Or if you're transferred prison to prison, they do that. It's, that kind of thing. Another very, very important job for the marshals is finding escaped convicts, right? So if you escape from police custody, it's the Marshal Service who's tasked with tracking you down and rearresting you and bringing you back to prison or back to court to show up for court or whatever. Any kind of wanted fugitive, it's the Marshal Service's job to go out and track and find you. The Postal Service. You're thinking, the Postal Service? Really? No, yeah. The Postal Service has their own law enforcement branch attached to their, normal letter-carrying duties. And interestingly, the Postal Service is one of their main investigation areas is pornography. Right? And you're thinking, pornography? Really? The Postal Service? Yeah, think about it. Before the internet, how was illegal pornography distributed? Through the mail, right? So it was the Postal Service back in the days prior to the internet that figured out or got tasked with investigating pornography crimes, whether it's, child porn or this or that. Not to say that other services don't investigate pornography, because the FBI has a huge child porn division too. But the Postal Service, one of their jobs is to investigate, any kind of pornography or whatever, if it goes through the mail, right? The Secret Service. Anybody know what the primary job area of the Secret Service is? All right, if you said protect the president, that is wrong. That is one of their jobs, but it is not their primary job, right? So we all think of the Secret Service as, they protect the president. There's a bunch of them. They're all stationed in the White House, and they make sure that the crazies don't jump the fence and assault the White House and all this stuff. Yes, that is their job, but their primary job, the main focus of most of those Secret Service agencies, is to investigate things like counterfeiting, right? The Secret Service is the primary law enforcement agency for the U.S. Treasury Department. The Treasury Department is the people that controls our money supply, right? So the Secret Service, their job is to investigate money crimes. So, financial fraud to counterfeiting to, all kinds of different money crimes, right? That's all the Secret Service's job. The FBI is kind of the primary law enforcement group for the Justice Department, right? So their head is the Attorney General. And they're kind of jack of all trades. They do a lot of different kind of investigation. And I'm sure we've all heard of the FBI, whether you watch X-Files or whatever. But they do everything from cybercrime and child porn to terrorism to kidnappings, to all kinds of different stuff. They have a lot of different investigation areas. They're very, very broad-based, very large, but they have their hand in a lot of pots, if you know what I mean. They do a lot of different things. The next one is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And I got to hang out with some of these guys, and one of the guys was wearing a T-shirt on the, and it said Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And then underneath that said, "Who's bringing the chips?" All right, because that sounds like a good time. But as their name suggests, their job is to investigate crimes that are somehow related to alcohol, tobacco, firearms, or explosives, right? So there's a lot of like domestic terrorism stuff that they investigate, moonshining, which is still a thing in the 21st century, where people make their own alcohol and then try to sell it without, paying the tax man. That's all BATFE jurisdiction. But they do a lot of work with all those different areas of crime, and there's a surprising amount that falls into those 4 categories. And then finally, there's the DEA. The DEA is the Drug Enforcement Agency. Their job is obviously to investigate drug crimes. They do a lot of work like at the U.S. border, because a lot of drugs come over the border. They do a lot of job at airports and seaports, because so many drugs come in through airports and seaports. But then they also do investigations just up and down, say, the interstate highways, because so many drugs are brought in, at kind of big ports of entry like Miami or Laredo, Texas, or way up in the northwest at what city is that? Up across the border from Vancouver, but whatever that is. Anyway, they have to, drugs are brought in over there, and then they're shipped around the country via the interstate system. So the DEA does a lot of investigations of, drug mules and drug importers and, all this kind of stuff to try to prevent, the cocaine and the meth and the heroin and all those things from coming into the country. And then again, there are others, right? This is a short list of kind of the bigger names in federal law enforcement. There's a whole bunch more, and they each kind of have their own specialized job, their own specialized jurisdiction, their own specialized kind of crimes that they investigate, right? So for instance, I mentioned earlier, the Environmental Protection Agency has their own law enforcement branch. Guess what they investigate? Environmental crimes. That's right. Good job. But anyway, so we're going to come back. We're going to do the second half of Section 5, and I will see you then.